Welcome to episode 2 of the commentary on colonialism. I'm Elisa, and I'll continue this exploration of the history and impact of colonialism. After my brother Edoardo introduced us to this subject in the first episode, I'll provide a commentary and expanded perspective on this complex historical period. The common context is quite harsh, so be prepared. I'm not saying this lightly. To fully understand the topic of colonialism, you need to listen to the first part. I'll leave a link in the description to the first episode. I know that this second episode is much more interesting and will keep you on the edge of your seat, but to understand how we got to this point, you need to watch the first episode. That being said, let's begin. In the 1700s, Europe saw the emergence of its first major capitalists and large banks. Around these transports, endless opportunities for insurance and credit arose. The English kept borrowing credits to buy and sell slaves, as immense wealth accumulated. This entails and credibly argued, often violently, for the sacred right to do as they pleased with their money, without being accountable to anyone, neither a monarch nor a church. Over time, this trend gradually melted the power of Christian institutions and political establishments in general, which reorganized to ensure an uninterrupted flow of money. This point, where politicians were merely obedient to a message of a global money flow, is now known as neo-colonialism. The idea of kidnapping Africans and using them as private property didn't originate with Europeans. They drew direct inspiration from what was already happening in the Arab world for 700 years in his voyages. Christopher Columbus managed to kidnap about 5,000 people, some of whom ended up being sold in Arab slave markets. Africans began to be trafficked in the Arab world starting into the 600s, a practice that continued for about 1,200 years. From the African continent to the west, people were kidnapped to be transported across the Atlantic to European economies. In the east, they become luxury items in Muslim worlds. These are quite significant differences between these two slavery systems. The first is the magnitude. Over 1,200 years, the Arab world kidnapped about 9 million people from Africa. In 300 years, Europeans transported about 12 million Africans. Due to the conditions, mortality was immense, so it's estimated that at least 24 million people disappeared from the continent due to slave markets. For these reasons, in 1800s, Africa's population was half of what it should have been. By the end of the 9th century, a quarter of the entire population of West Africa had been kidnapped and deported to European camps. Another difference is that 2/3 of the people sold in Arab slave markets were women. They were primarily placed in harems, exploited sexually, and then forced into domestic labor. Therefore, slavery of Africans in the Arab world never interested itself as a socio-economic essential for the state's prosperity. As it was not essential, no desperate system developed to extract as many people as possible for insertion into the economic production line. Consequently, there were no rigid culture establishments to endlessly demonstrate the inferiority of African humans. Arab racism, for instance, was more nuanced, and partly because one of the most important apostles of Prophet Muhammad was a freed African slave. Since African slaves were more difficult to obtain and much more expensive in the Arab world, they were considered a relatively precious luxury. However, this did not prevent Arabs from committing all sorts of atrocities. In terms of brutality, it's absurd and sickening to compare who was getting gentler in kidnapping and turning people into private property. The process was incredibly violent on both sides. The major difference was that Europeans did a turbo version. They industrialized it and created an entire machinery functioning on African battery power. People from all energy was extracted until they died and were replaced, because it was cheaper to replace them than to keep them alive. In the transatlantic trade, over 70% of them were men, as they were considered batteries that died more slowly. The major difference, therefore, is that Africans were seen as raw material for the industrialization of Western civilization. As a result, the profits from the slavery remained as cultural forces that continued to dedicate the shape of Western civilization. This industrialization comes with factory logic. If people are commodities, they are optimization systems for transporting goods, based on certain impersonal calculations. Ships were specially built to cram as many people as possible, accepting that many of them would die due to these conditions. Because in the final calculation, the transport remained profitable. The margin was about 10 or 20%. If out of 500 people, 400 survives, that was considered a success. People were tied and transported for 2 months in spaces like coffins where they lay on their backs and couldn't even turn from side to side. In these conditions, many of them, among all the other ways they died, would suffocate. Being merchandise, it was common practice that there were problems, such as shortage of drinking water. 100 Africans would be thrown into the ocean as accounting loss. They often threw themselves into the ocean, as well if they escaped from chains, trying to escape the terror of the transport conditions. This system marked the first instance of a systemic institutionalized examination of large groups of people. For the first time, large-scale genocide could be done on a colonial belt optimized. The term genocide was contained in 1944 by a poll to describe the extermination of Jews. It means the mass destruction of a specific kind of people. The need for a word for this became urgent when the exterminations began to visibly occur in the North or Europe. Although genocides were happening before, and they were very intentional in America and Africa. In this entire system of slavery, a particularly controversial fact is that Africans themselves were an essential part of this facilitation. Europeans rarely ventured into the depths of the continent to kidnap people, primarily because they were tempted to do so. They usually died from various diseases. The life expectancy of a European on the African continent was about a year, so they only colonized the coast of the ocean, where they built forts and buildings where Africans were brought and kept in hellish conditions until a ship came to take them on another world, though they called New World. In Africa, there was a dominion slavery, but it was much more complex than Europe's definition of the phenomenon. Slaves were not personal property. They could themselves own land, hold positions, marry according to their desires, and some became important political figures. These descriptions came from astonished Europeans wondering how the slave people, seemingly exercising more authority than their masters in various administrative matters, were still slaves. There were also different levels of slavery, depending on how you ended up in that position. If you were a prisoner of war or a criminal, then your rights were diminished. Otherwise, orphans and poor people technically became slaves. However, they retained their status as humans and were part of society. There may not have been a very clear awareness of what happened to the people who were taken on ships and disappeared on the horizon. In Africa, there is no European plantation that stands as evidence of the treatment received, although attempts were made and failed because people kept revolting. As I've mentioned throughout this video, Africans obviously didn't see themselves as Africans. There were multiple different cultures and ethnicities living together, peacefully or not. In his 1965 book, Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of Ghana, actually calls the balkanization of Africa the triggering of conflicts between the existing sects. The conflict in question there was who gets kidnapped and sent overseas and who doesn't, a significant conflict. The Europeans had all sorts of innovative schemes for kidnapping, such as saving a brother or sister from the slave fort, where they awaited their person. If you kidnapped and brought 2 other people in return, a pyramid scheme with slaves. The phenomenon was such as magnitude that African empires like Damai and Astai were built around the ability to protect their own people. They captured people and offered them in exchange for their weapons they used, so as not to be captured themselves. There were certainly countless Africans who did this voluntarily for personal enrichment and amusement, but this was to satisfy a network imposed by Europeans who made slavery an inevitable phenomenon on the continent. It depended on which part of the chain you wanted to be in. For centuries, these were political conditions which African societies existed. The situation ended when Europeans became capable of conquering the entire continent and no longer had to limit themselves to ports. After about 300 years of this, in 1884, the major European powers divided Africa at a conference in Berlin, and with the help of new atomic firearms, they easily conquered the entire continent, which they held until the 1950s. In all these conditions, it is truly a wonder how the African countries did not flourish like the beautiful European gardens. This question baffles scientists. More likely, it's just as suspected for centuries. It's simply the fault of Africans for not having the gardener's touch. In the 1700s, the largest transporter and benefactor of slave labor was England, which eventually became Great Britain in 1647. An English colonel who founded plantation on the island for Barbados reported that in 3 years he sold a 1,000 investment into 100,000. That was the level of profit from this entire business. This is how capital accumulates, seeking new investment directions. The long and complicated process of developing the steam engine was financed by plantation owners. It then fueled the Industrial Revolution, which was propelled rapidly by an entire automation of cotton processing by individuals who made their fortunes from slaves. In that year, testimonies were countless and full of enthusiasm as the transformative effect that capital from slavery and on British society. A well-known economic role, the trade in blacks and worsening natural consequences can be estimated as an integral source of wealth and naval power for this nation. Therefore, basic principles that are foundation for everything else, the main arch of the machinery that sets every wheel in motion. He attempted to explain that the British Empire is just a magnificent superstructure founded on this trade, so it should be further pursued. 200 years later, Winston Churchill, in a speech at the banquet, said, "Our possession of the West Indies, as well as India, gives us the power, the support, but above all the capital to free of great struggles from the Napoleonic Wars." In the tough competition of the 18th and 19th centuries, it allowed us not to only accumulate the variety of goods we have, but to also lay the foundations of that commercial and financial leadership that allowed us to build a great position in the world. When more serious discussions about ending the slave trade, not slavery itself, began in the late 1700s, politicians from Bristol, Liverpool, and Birmingham protested that this will mean the destruction of these cities. As quickly as they were built, they would collapse without the main industry of trafficking people. In Liverpool at this point, 60% of the national ships engaged in slave trading and 40% of the European total. In all these cities, there are states in honor of the great entrepreneurs who developed the local economies in this way, and the status of these states is controversial for all the reasons we've been mentioning. In 2018, someone in the British government deemed it appropriate to publish the light-hearted tweet. Did you know that in 1833, British used 20 million, 40% of the national budget, to buy the freedom of the slaves in this empire? The amount of money borrowed for slavery abolition, the degree was so large that it was not fully paid off until 2015, which means that the British citizens alive today contributed to the payment to end slave trade. 20 million was 5% of the GDP in 1833, so the equivalent today as a state effort would be 100 billion. These payments were the start of way various emancipation happened during that era. What is particularly important and not obvious in such Friday fun facts is where this money went. With today's mindset, when you've read such things, you might be tempted to believe that reputation were paid to the victims, and in a way you would be right, except the victims were someone else. The victims were the slaves' owners, who with this abolition had just lost significant properties. So as not to cry too much and to appease them, the British government paid the equivalent of 130 billion to the slave masters. This means that until 2015, British taxpayers continued to compensate these human property owners. In history, there has been a practice of states reduplicating certain debts considered immoral legacies of older regimes. Great Britain did not think it was the case, because the entire was born from the money of slavery and continually between then and now. Many British citizens are descendants of the slave exploited in the Caribbean. So for them, in a particular way, a Friday super fun fact would be to find out of their own money. They have been paying reparations to the people who own these families. You might say it's not a fun fact. The magnitude of this unpropelled payment in history until the 2008 economic crisis also demonstrates how essential these slaves were to the British economy. It shows the estimated market value of these properties, called people. Owners were lined up to receive the damages, so in 1834, a comprehensive register of individuals benefiting from slavery was produced. The family of two British prime ministers were in his 9th century register, William Gladstone and yesterday's David Cameron. In contrast, for 2,500 slaves owned by Gladstone's family, the equivalent of 8 million was paid. David Cameron's family received only $3 million for the 202 African privately owned individuals in Jamaica. Among the 47,000 and thousands sole operations were trustees, politicians and banks. The majority of this capital was reinvested in British society and its industrialisation, including railways, banks and factories. This street manages to be wrong in a multitude of different ways. The ban of the slave trade happened in 1807, and this trade was oddly considered a completely different issue from the slave ownership. When the slaves were emancipated in 1843, they actually had to wait for 4 more years because it was considered that they weren't ready to transition from the status of private property to that of human beings. They needed to be trained for this through another 4 years of unpaid mandatory labor called apprenticeship, so as not to experience too much shock, to have time to get used to the idea of freedom, because everyone agreed that if they were given freedom abruptly, they suddenly wouldn't know what to do with it. It would have panicked them. They would have lost their minds. I think now is the time to see what learned people from the time said about all these things. John Locke is considered the father of liberalism, a great theorist of private property, and a strong advocate of democracy. He was a highly read political philosopher while he was still alive, and his writing functioned as a kind of Bible of freedom that you consulted when you were confused. Consequently, it's worth investigating a bit more about his influence, especially in how America developed. English politicians in the new overseas colonies wrote to him and asked for his help. "Mr. Locke, tell us what to do. How do we structure our legal system?" Very controversially, in 1669, Locke participated in writing the Constitution of the colonial state, and in it he said, "Every free man in Carolina of any opinion or religion shall have absolute power and authority over his black slaves." Absolute power in legal terms meant that these individuals were considered private property and could have been killed or not, as one pleased. Another problematic aspect was that Locke was a shareholder at the Royal Africa Company for 3 years, whose purpose was trading Africans. Based on these 2 points, some in the academic world consider him a major promoter of transatlantic slavery. However, when he did these things, he was a functionary within a monarchy. He would later contest. It's possible that his involvement in the mentioned constitution was merely as a notary validating a document. He seems to have had shares because the government, at one point, paid its officials in the absence of liquidity. When slavery was abolished in 1865 in America, the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, the only place the word appears in the American Constitution. Neither slavery nor the involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States of any place subject to their jurisdiction. Half the words are dedicated to this exception. Through this exception, forced labor remains a very present phenomenon in America. To turn someone into a slave, you just have to convict them of a crime, and since Africans were considered criminals merely by existing, the industrial prison complex slowly but surely developed, which is still one of the many chapters where America ranks number 1. For more details on this subject, the documentary 13th is very good. Returning to Locke, it must be reiterated that the Lost War was the one against any combatants opposing the European secession process. In his treatise, he endlessly refers to the indigenous people of America as wild beasts, predatory beasts, dangerous hungry beasts, and in general animals with whose humans cannot coexist. Therefore, they can be destroyed like lions or tigers. The so-called black human species, Locke claimed, emerged when African women began having sex with monkeys. Locke's objection to slavery were related to the establishment of an alternative. If too few people owned too many slaves, it destabilized the concept of freedom that he strongly held on to. So if possible, it is said that Locke never especially encouraged the plantation of slavery institutions. There is no doubt about this contribution to the increasingly scientific racial hierarchy establishment during the Enlightenment. The racial core of the Enlightenment movement is best summarized by Carl Linnaeus, a prominent Swedish biologist who has a Swedish university named after him. In 1758, he scientifically described the situation with human species as follows: Europaeus albus, ingenius vae signuin lively governed by law, Americanus rubescus. Conte with his institution, lovers of freedom, tanned and irascible. Governed by customs, Asiactus Lodidius. Yellow Macalonic, governed by opinion after Niger. Shrewd, lazy, negligent black government by the arbitrary will of the master. This being the situation, it was widely accepted that it was impossible to civilize this cunning African people. But if you felt benevolent and want to try, the only way they might have a choice is if they make themselves. This was a matter of education, meaning you were educated if you knew things stood like this. And if you mourned for Africans, it simply meant you lacked education and didn't know they were made for slavery. There was more studying to do. In this century, two parallel discussions about what freedom means emerged. The first came from Injustice's roots, later formulated by Rousseau's, eventually evolving to ideas that would be called sociality, equality, fraternity, and pleasant coexistence within society as a whole. Though there was the freedom of capital, the freedom of aristocracy, the corporation to be as little constrained by any government as possible and essentially to treat employees and slaves as they pleased. The second freedom came to define capitalism, and the ideas behind it are repacked today under the term neoliberalism. Symbolically, we say that we have the French Revolution versus the American Revolution here. So let's follow them one by one. The American Revolution was the War of Independence, which began in 1775, when affluent people in America revolted against their independence on England and refused to pay taxes and tributes to the empire in which they had no political participation. John Adams, one of the founding fathers, even formulated the slogan, "We won't be the blacks," something remarkable. For this revolution's purpose in this early phase, freedom was defined as the right to political self-governance, not to be told by someone across the ocean how to organize your yard. In 1764, Benjamin Franklin, the money man, went to London to try to argue for Americans' freedom. In response, he received various ridicules. "You Americans make a great fuss about any small infringement on what you consider your liberties, and yet there is no soul on earth with such enemies of freedom, such tyrants, absolutely you from any Enlightenment Scottish philosopher, who said, it provides a curious spectacle to observe how the same people who speak lofty about political freedom and who consider the privilege of imposing their own taxes as one of the unbelievable rights of mankind, have no scruples on reducing a large proportion of their fellow creatures to circumstances where not only are they deprived of property, but also of almost every species of rights. Fate may never have produced situations more calculated to ridicule liberal hypotheses, or to show a little of the behavior of men to be dedicated by any philosophical principles, and so, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes? This last question manages to be particularly insulting on multiple axes at the same time. The English ridiculated the Americans, especially because they owned so many slaves within their societies, which was considered improper. Everyone knows that a truly civilized and free person keeps the African slaves out of sight, not in plain view where you might run into them when you go to the bathroom. In response, the Americans conjured, "How can you lecture us about slavery when we are the biggest slave traffickers?" Indeed, at this point, England even forcefully delivered Africans to the African colonies. When the colonies protested that they no longer needed a caring mother constantly putting slaves on their plates when they couldn't handle it anymore. Well, these two civilized societies kept arguing for about 10 years until war broke out. The final retort is found in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson wrote that America must be free from the tyrant king of England, who traffics people and sells them in markets. The French Revolution, on the other hand, started from a fully European liberalism and then went overboard. It was regretted post facto that they weren't overboard with freedom. In 1763, France was just a loser in a major European war that lasted 7 years, called the 7 Years' War. Being the loser, France was deprived of the majority of its colonies, and those that remained were an extra burden. This law led to France to begin to critically examine all this colonialism around them. At the forefront of liberal doctrine were the importance of eliminating the possession of its all forms, so that no absolute power rested in the hands of any God-ordained monarch, and in general, such powers should not be hereditary and transmitted through blood, but chosen through a legislative form. All rebels agreed on this point. However, some French people began to say that this colonial situation strongly resembled the regimes they supposedly tried to escape from. Instead of royalty nobility, they now had skin color nobility. The absolute power of the king became the absolute power of the slave owner of the colonizer. Is that odd? Furthermore, what kind of liberalism is it that the people who can participate in it depend on hereditary qualities, namely whether they were born white or black? Some French individuals interpreted that the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence knows that property owners have equal rights, and that all people in general, regardless of state and properties. This kind of opinions at that time was no longer called liberalism and socialism, because the people who advocated it were considered reasonable fanatics. The Haitian Constitution written after the revolution is the only one in the world that defines the victims of slavery as the slaves and the not slave owners. Beyond the economic challenge, there was also the issue that an African revolution would disrupt all the European science. It was as if Africans were a lazy human species waiting to be told what to do. How could they revolt and achieve their self-determination? This undiscussed revolution at the time inspired terror throughout the free people's veins. We now need to make another leap in time and space to arrive at the practically elusive present. In all the conditions we discussed, after 300 years of exterminating colonialism, in 1884, the major European powers decided it was a good time to invade Africa entirely and appropriate territories properly. The conquest of Africa had already begun for some years, but in 1884, the civilized world met to formalize exactly which piece belongs to whom, so as not to step on each other's toes and to have everything well organized. In these efforts, borders were drawn in. Africa that had no connection to various peoples and cultural living there were arranged. As the British Prime Minister of the time mentioned, we engaged in drawing lines or maps of territories of no white man who ever set foot. We gave each other mountains and rivers, the only small impediment being that we never knew exactly where the mountains, rivers, and lakes were located. In colonial Africa, there are no national states according to the European definition that emerged in the 17th century. Here is a translation of the text you provided. No sort of imaginary lines on a map dedicated to your realities, but rather belonging to a certain culture of eternity, regardless of its geographical spread. When Europeans imposed national borders, a double-standard violence was committed. On one hand, they grouped cultures that had no connection with each other, and on the other hand, they imposed this new reality with imaginary physical limits. The same applies to the Middle East, where equally Europeans decided to borders that cramped rival cultures into the same state, forcing them to fight for nationhood, as apparently there was now something to gain. The constant tensions in the Middle East was a direct result of these arbitrary participations without any consideration for the local variety. In Africa as well, it led to endless conflicts that were heard in the European world only where they reached alarming levels, such as the Rwandan genocide. The request of Africa happened for a general massacre. Europeans were now armed with automatic rifles, completely different to the courage of the rapid pursuit. There were so-called battles where European losses were 50 people and African losses were 20,000. I don't think there is a mental space here for yet another variety of genocides, because I, for one, can't take it anymore, but I feel it's still happening. The first war was still to be mentioned briefly because it's quite well known. At the Berlin Conference, King Leopold of Belgium received the Congo state as his own territory, a huge region in his heart of Africa, 10 times the size of Romania, and 70 times larger than Belgium itself. The Congo was full of rubber trees, and in 1888, the inflatable rubber tire was invented. There's the first air-filled wheel that actually worked. At the same time, automobiles were appearing, so suddenly there was an infinite market for rubber. So Leopold established from private companies to handle the extraction of rubber. Under the military power of Belgian bullets, all Africans in the region were forced to start gathering rubber. Those who refused were killed in the most sadistic ways possible. This is what John Connor's novel, Heart of Darkness, is about, because he spent a few months in the Congo and saw with his own eyes what was happening. The novel is important because it offers the European world a faithful reflection of what capitalism and colonialism looks like, a reflection of how the civilization mission is put into the practice at the beginning of the 20th century. Because also in Congo, like everywhere else, The rhetoric was about sharing the gift of European progress across seas and countries. The book was ignored at the time of its publication, but in the 1960s, when discussions were heated about the colonial past of the civilization, it became essential. For Robert, over a period of 23 years until 1908, between 2 and 10 million Africans were killed. It's impossible to estimate exactly, and both ends of this estimate are well argued. But in 1919, the Belgian state concluded that in these 23 years, half of the local population had been killed. The story is in all error is found in this book called King Leopold's Ghost. But we move on because another genocide still needs to be discussed. It illustrates in a very resentful way an essential mechanism of colonialism. In Rwanda, around 1 million people were killed in 1984. The news around this event confirmed the suspicion of the Western world about African barbarity. Look, even when we left alone, they just kill each other with machetes. But like Rwandan state, like all the others, was a product of colonialism. In the region, there was always a minority called Tutsi and a majority Hutu. And between these two entities, there were always tensions and conflicts. When it was given as a slice of cake to Germany, they started efforts to form a Tutsi allied to help them govern the colony. They began an institutionalized segregation where schools accessible only to the Tutsi minority are built, while the majority Hutu are subjected to forced labor. When Belgians took over the territory in 1916, they divided society into ruling Tutsi and the poor Hutu, intensifying this division further, which produced endless animosity between two entities. Tutsi gave orders and Hutu obeyed them. This division was based on dizzying racial considerations. Tutsi were taller and somewhat lighter in color, so the Belgians agreed that they were actually Europeans with black skin, further worrying the burden of civilizing mission. Under these circumstances, over many years, intense hatred developed between the two entities, finding its final explosion in the 1994 genocide, when the Hutu, defined for decades as inferior, killed hundreds of thousands of superior Tutsi. However, colonialism passed from the destruction of the Aztecs to today. It relied on igniting such regional conflicts. Regional conflicts are everywhere, but when someone insists and dictates that someone is superior and others are slaves, according to the good teachings of European culture. One of the most dramatic portions was suffered by the Indian subcontinent. After World War II, a global wave of decolonization began, in which empires withdrew their flags from the territories they held. This happened mostly because Nazi despotism had made the entire community of free people tormented temporarily for 6 years about the rights of people not to be invaded and controlled by another country. Under these circumstances, and after so much fighting and atrocities, imperialism on the surface began downright unattractive. In 1945, the United Nations was formed, and in the first article of the chapter of the new organization, it was written that the people of the world have equal rights and the right of self-determination. A good slogan like the other framed slogans that look very good, but rarely have any connection to the reality achieved in their name. Something similar had been tried with the League of Nations after World War I, but then no one took over the commitment to decolonize very seriously. In 1947, however, dramatically Great Britain withdrew from the territory previously called the British Dries, setting the tone. Because if Great Britain gave up India, it meant that this time it was swapping for real. There was a Hindi majority and a Muslim minority on the Indian subcontinent. The British said that if they felt everyone in the same country, they would end up in a civil war, so they decided to divide the zone into Muslim, Pakistan in the north and Hindu India in the south. Doing this so rapidly and without any planning, overnight, about 50 million people found themselves on the wrong side of the borders, suddenly having to leave their homes and move to the designated state. This chaos led to all kinds of violence and massacres. In some regions like Kashmir, the fight continued. For decades, the main activity of the United Nations was to mediate all the post-colonial conflicts through so-called peacekeeping operations. Societies declared free after endless years of colonialism were proudly dysfunctional, intentionally damaged by European imperialism. So chaos was installed almost everywhere. Colonialism always worked on the principle of underdevelopment, despite infinite rhetoric about civilization. There was never a goal to support the process of dominating people. They had to remain docile to fulfill the goals of empires. All mechanisms were made in such a way as to support keeping things stagnant. Total submission to authority. European empires always relied on corrupt local concentrated groups, often religious, to maintain things as they were for tens of hundreds of years. When colonization happened, or there are civil wars between the divided entities until then, or the corrupt elites who had collaborated with the empires until they take control and essentially continue to elaborate with the imperial requirements. That's why the notion that Western civilization ever tried to support the progress of the surrounding world is ridiculous. Propagating this idea today only repeats hundreds of years of colonial propaganda that repeated this endlessly, while exploiting conquered territories according to their own needs, to the great detriment of the locals. The always built always had the sole purpose of fascinating resources extracted by its colonizers. The most long-standing cliché argument in favor of colonialism in this, well, railways were built where there were none. Genocide is genocide, but who has railways? The points collected by these railways often had no social relevance. They simply connected mines and plantations to the ocean coasts, where European ships came to collect their rewards. Many of these railways were abandoned when the resources that needed to be extracted were depleted and the souls destroyed. It's like if I build a road to your backyard so that I can come with cars and steal everything you have, destroy your society and subjugate your mother. And then I say, don't be sad, look, now you have a road. We can all agree that objectively the road is good, if there can be debate about other things. The road is good itself. I finally found it. In the 19th century, slavery became too blatant, and the exploration of the possibility to force people to work in a familiar system, but under a different title, began. Instead of coercing them with the whip's force, people could be coerced through economic conditions. They either work under the conditions dedicated by the matter industrials, or face starvation, or end up on the streets, from where they are taken and put into forced labor institutions. This way, the system remains clean. The work is not forced but obligatory. The despot disappears, yet the obligation remains. A very similar relationship happens today. Try not to work, and we'll see how you pay your rent and eat. The whip disappears, but the economic pressure remains. Because now all small or large companies are under the state's authority, and wherever you work, the state takes a piece of the big pie of each company. But let's get back to the main object. Colonialism is not just something that happened at a certain moment. A few hundred years ago, a small historical event that everyone got over, and everyone about their business. The capital in capitalism is the capital accumulated through slavery in colonialism. The way the system is born is through the abduction and subjection of teens and hundreds of millions of people worldwide, forced to work for free to enrich a very small group of individuals. This is what shapes it and the times its rules and mechanism. To keep it running, there must always be someone very poor so that someone else can be very rich, both locally and globally. This is the system for the mental axis, which keeps turning. For this reason, a superficial amendment of capitalism can never produce anything other than a superficial improvements in these inequalities. If you don't want to perpetuate a world divided between incredibly wealthy individuals and people barely make it from day to day, we need to make as radical changes as possible in how this would operate. Minor adjustments will never have the power to change these intrinsic power relations. The identified problem since 1776 is that wealth comes with political power, and this political power will never legislate in favor of its own diminishment or disappearance. So here, we are in a curious situation. How do you propose we proceed? We now have the added problem that all these things don't happen in a vacuum but in an organic environment that reacts to its transformation into a planetary factory. Despite the heated discussions in recent years about global warming, the institutional measures taken by wealthy states, which contribute the most to the consumption of the planet, continue to the history. The latest IPCC report, published on March 19, indicates that based on current policies, we are most likely heading towards an average warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius. The freezefall considered so far as 1.5 degrees beyond, with a chain of catalysm is triggered with a domino effect that cannot even be calculated. It's essential to emphasize in these discussions that this is a planetary average in specific places on the planet. In fact, this would mean a warming of 10 degrees, the difference between 40 degrees and 50 degrees. Determining the exact to which it is still possible to live in such areas. which will be limited or almost impossible. The most dramatic effects of these changes will be felt in the poorest countries in the world. In a true display of poetic injustice, the planetary factory built for the exploitation of the global south will lead to disasters. From which the global south will suffer the most when people start fleeing for 50 degrees heat, when water disappears, the environment catches fire. Will it still be blamed on them, because they are not made of the right material to thrive? The planet transforming capitalism was born in parallel with a toxic culture, which for hundreds of years hammered the idea that a person's worth is determined by how much money they produce and consume. The idea of a person as a smaller or larger cog in a machinery. This is the inertia of Western culture deeply embedded in situations and beliefs over hundreds of years, and it wasn't suddenly whipped over the face of the earth. The reason I made these clips is that last year, the high representative of the European Union's diplomacy found it appropriate to declare the Europeans is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. In a jungle, we all know that only animals live, so I need to explore in detail the problems of this idea, which turns out to be the core around which this present civilization has developed. Joseph Borrell only woke up to explicitly say their names in 2022, but this is exactly the fertile ground from which, when needed, mass purges and dehumanizers arise. We find ourselves at a historic point where the need to consider other people less human based on various criteria will become more pronounced, so we can avoid making any irrational changes. To keep the current system running, the price will be once again complete numbness in the face of the suffering of other people who, according to European culture, are not really people, especially if they are very poor and especially if they have a very different hue. So we shouldn't bother too much. From my point of view, from this seat I'm in, this seems to be what is happening. I succeeded. In this clip, about 10% of the things that struck me strongly in the research procedure produced. If you find yourself deeply moved by this information, there are countless sources that offer much more interesting details and delve into 2-minute segments from this clip in books of hundreds of pages. I've laid the sources I used plus recommendations for related books in the description. From my perspective, in the story told here, the most dramatic aspects are missing. The colonization of Asia. What happened in American society once slavery was abolished? How the slaves in the colonies were replaced by billions of Indians and Chinese workers who were, in fact, still in a form of slavery, and the struggles and assassinations during the colonialism period after World War II. We would have liked to explicitly explore the story of Algeria, which escaped French control already in 1962 for a long war, probably in one way or another. These topics will find their place in future clips, but until then, I'll leave you the recommendations in the description. The easiest book to start with will be The New Age of Empire, which strives, in a not terribly rigorous academic way, to provide an overview of hundreds of years of imperialism and, I think, to manages to create a good starting point of this whole history. Another aspect I would have liked to address is what the difference between imperialism and colonialism might mean. As far as I understand, imperialism involves the mechanism of exploitation of colonialism, plus the force of culture, namely the force of the ideas that justify all the exploitation. In India, for example, the British had installed an education system in which Indian children were badly taught that they are inferior species that must obey the superior English, who in there are to guide them in life because of the old they would have chosen to ruin. The arrogance of the European culture we discussed didn't manifest itself in whispers on its own continent, but was forcibly imposed on distant people who had to understand and assimilate the fact that they were inferior. These cultural balances have a minor longer in the unpredictable life and continue to produce the effects long after flags have been withdrawn from territories. One of the tangible legacies of online colonialism is the notion that all these things were perfectly normal and inevitable. Today we can contemplate with sincerity endless strings of horror that happened on an unpredictable scale because we are told that they are happened in the names of progress and could not have been otherwise. Yesterday's inevitability becomes today inevitability. What ultimately colonizes all this spectacular momentum is our minds. The flags planted, they are those of racism, and the notion that the natural way of human existence is to be a factory and to be treated like a factory among factories. These flags are planted as deep as possible, and they are often ways meant when talking in various contexts about the decolonization of oneself. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much to the people who have been following us all this time for their trust and patience. And I wish you all pleasant decolonization.